go on. But first, I'd like to move to our first speaker today, Dave Cliff, who's actually joining us from Geneva in Switzerland. Dave is the CEO of the Global Road Safety Partnership. And you've been there, Dave, since 2017, although I know that previously you had been working in New Zealand. For those who are not familiar with GRSP, it's a hosted program within the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies, and is focused on reducing road trauma in low and middle income countries. I've been looking actually, Dave, at so much of the work, and the work that you're particularly doing with roads policing capacity and kind of building that up in various countries. So I know there's a lot that you'll be sharing with us on what can be done. But prior to joining GRSP, Dave served as the Assistant Commissioner for Road Policing in New Zealand and was also Assistant Commissioner responsible for all policing functions across New Zealand's South Island. And I think there will be a wealth of experience. And one of the things I think is so helpful to us here in Ireland is when we can learn, when we can see what has happened in other countries and what perhaps we might be able to pick up on that. So this morning, Dave is going to be talking about the proven power of random breath testing and in particular lessons from New Zealand and Australia. Dave, if I could hand over to you, I'm really looking forward to hearing your contribution this morning. Thank you.
Right, thanks for that introduction, Sheila. And I'll just share this presentation with you and then we can make a start. Okay, so firstly, by way of background, random breath testing programs have been operating across Australia and New Zealand since the late 1980s, 1990s. They really started to ramp up. So it's very much a standard part of the way in which road policing is delivered in our part of the world. So I'll just begin with a little bit on deterrence to give you an understanding of the background to this. So firstly, we think about deterrence in two ways. We think about general deterrence, which is the threat of legal punishment and its impact on the public at large. So it's not necessarily being affected directly by it, but it's the fear that people have of detection if they break the law. What we know is highly visible enforcement supported by public awareness programs, such as breath testing large numbers of drivers, is the sort of activity that generates high levels of general deterrence. We also know from the psychology of human beings that simple unsafe behaviours, for example, drink driving, where there's one decision made at the beginning of a journey, drive or don't drive, is highly affected by general deterrence. So seeing road policing activity, it being publicised, hearing it being spoken about are examples of general deterrence. The other deterrence mechanism is really catching people. So specific deterrence is the impact that catching individuals and hearing about, obviously, people being caught has on deterrence. But we know that the deterrence mechanisms between different behaviour types, so for example, drink driving versus speeding, are different, whereas speeding requires high levels of catching individuals to deter. Drink driving works in a different way. So I just wanted to make that distinction at the outset. A couple of definitions just to explain. So I'll talk about random breath testing and compulsory breath testing. Really the same thing. And when I talk about that, it's legislation that allows police to stop drivers at any time or place without suspicion, with no legal restrictions at all on when or where tests can be conducted. And I think you have that legislation in place at the moment across Ireland. I'll also talk about booze buses. So these were introduced firstly in the state of Victoria in Australia, and they're really mobile breath testing sites. So it means that when a checkpoint is set up, a driver who, through the preliminary breath test, shows that they're above the limit they'll then go to this vehicle and be evidentially processed on the roadside. They were really put in place for two reasons. One, it was a very public statement that we take the issue seriously, so they're very visible. You certainly can't miss them. And also it creates high levels of efficiency, so police don't need to take a driver back to a police station. They can process them on the roadside, and it creates efficiency in terms of the volume of evidential tests that are possible. So firstly, just talking about measurement, and this is important, how do we measure whether we're really having an impact? And the most reliable measure of the minimum impact is really this: the number of drivers who are fatally injured and found to have a blood alcohol concentration above this limit of 0.05. The reason that we focus on this measure is because it is generally absolute. So there's a driver who's killed, there's a post-mortem process, a blood sample is taken, and that blood sample is analysed, and a result is known. Other measures, for example, where there's no fatally injured drivers, or it relies on police undertaking roadside testing, entering it into traffic crash report. Sometimes they're missed, sometimes drivers aren't breath tested, and so the data is often incomplete. But if we stay with this measuring the number of fatally injured drivers, we tend to have almost all of those being recorded accurately. I want to talk now a little bit about Hommel's principles and who he was. The background is Ross Hommel is a criminologist based in New South Wales in Australia. And when the problem of drink driving was really being identified as a major public health issue across Australia and New Zealand, police went to Ross and said, how do we design a program to deter drink driving? So Ross Hommel, putting on his criminologist hat, said, if you develop a program that follows these principles, so highly visible, rigorously enforced, sustained over time and well publicised, this will have the greatest opportunity to deter drink driving. So the program that was developed in Australasia was very much based on the work of Ross Hommel. And so within police, educating police officers, operational police, leaders in police on Hommel's theory and how it works was very much part of the education and training provided to people like me as a junior police officer, and always took those principles through my career. And we always went back to Hommel's principles when looking at our program and adapting it. There were other key requirements that we identified. One was random and unpredictable times and locations of testing. So drivers couldn't pick where we would be or when we would be there, but know that it was regular and it couldn't be avoided. We discovered the importance of focusing on key risk times. Drink driving, as we know, is not evenly distributed across the week or the time of the day. There are specific high-risk times, which we call high alcohol hours, and I'll talk a little bit about those later, and we need to focus on those key risk times. Then the issue of dosage, and I'll provide some data from Australia and New Zealand showing the volumes of testing that we worked up and decided to focus on to generate maximum levels of testing. In other words, how much testing is required to create the deterrence that we wanted. And then, which something you'll understand intimately in Ireland, is there are differences between urban communities and rural communities, and there's a different approach required to breath testing operations in those different locations. So firstly, in terms of highly visible, it's simple, really. We want as many drivers as possible to be exposed to highly visible random testing. So even if they don't get tested because they're travelling in the opposite direction. We want people to see it because seeing it reinforces the general deterrence message. Look at the police, they're out there. We see signage telling us what's going on, breath testing, prepare to stop. And so this is all reinforcing this message that the police take the issue very, very seriously and are determined to prevent drink driving. So highly visible. Next part of it is rigorously enforced. So the credibility of the program has to be maintained. No one avoids testing. So as the assistant commissioner or my the boss, the commissioner, it wouldn't matter whether we were stopped or the mayor, the prime minister, any public figure, everybody is tested. There is no exceptions if you are stopped. So there's no waving through a taxi or someone we might know or particular vehicle types. Rigorous testing means that everyone is tested. We focus on those high alcohol hours, as I've said. The testing is random and unpredictable, so we don't put in place a checkpoint and leave it there for 3 hours. They're usually shorter duration. They move frequently, so drivers can't predict where they'll be. And we don't keep going back to the same sites so that drivers become accustomed to being stopped anywhere on the network at any time, but focusing on key risk times. And we decided on this target of 1 breath test per licensed driver per year was the target numerically. So it didn't mean everyone was stopped once per year, but on average, we would aim to test people at least once a year. But obviously, if people are tending to travel at night on weekends, they are more likely to be stopped because of the way we target. And with some research that was undertaken in Australia found this in terms of the finding. Many drivers were aware of random breath testing on the roads, but they didn't see random breath testing as random. They could predict where it was going to be, which was a useful piece of information because police were becoming predictable. So in terms of the operational planning, it's got to ensure it is random and unpredictable so drivers can't predict where it will be. We want them to change their behaviour, and they do change their behaviour when they know that they can't predict where that testing will be, but know it is regular. When I talk about high alcohol hours, this is information from New Zealand, and we simply put into each 2-hour period across a week the number of alcohol-related casualty collisions with 5 years of data. And what you'll see there is the highest risk periods, and I imagine it's similar in Ireland, but you would need to look at your own data, from Friday nights at 8 p.m. through to 2 in the morning, and then from Saturday night from 8 p.m. through to 4 in the morning. Those are the absolute key risk times in New Zealand, but other high risk times in the yellow area also are areas of higher risk. So the breath testing operations of police focus on those key risk times, simply because that's when the majority of the trauma is occurring. We know that from this data you will see too that there's no time period across a week that's immune, but it's at a much lower level. And so we've got to use that scarce police resource at times of greatest risk. And I'd really encourage you to use this sort of display to show those key risk times and then focus on breath testing when the risk is greatest across the country of Southern Ireland. For the general public to change their behaviour, the program has got to be sustained over time. So again, where I'm from, we've got dedicated random breath testing groups. They're working across the week, every day, every month, running these operations to maximise the visibility, random and unpredictable testing. But we used to have this belief that we just ran drink drive operations on Easter or Christmas and the problem was solved. We know that doesn't work. It's got to be sustained week in, week out, right across each year. So sustaining the operation over time is very important. In terms of publicity, ongoing publicity to highlight the road policing activity, what it's for, which is to protect people from alcohol-impaired drivers, is really important. So this is part of the general deterrence. You're seeing highly visible operations, you're hearing about them, there's media coverage, there's publicity. And I know there's been some great work done by Velma on publicising the issue, which directly supports enhanced enforcement. Police also add to this by issuing media releases about the number of drivers they tested. The program publicity needs to reach all cultures, age groups, particularly in the communities that are at risk, which where I'm from is often younger males tend to be particularly at risk, and older males who tend to have these entrenched drink driving habits. So we need to identify who our risk groups are and really focus publicity on them. We always pride ourselves on the professionalism of the police operation. So really professionally set up checkpoints, lots of lighting, flashing lights, no ability to evade the testing. Once a driver sees a checkpoint in the distance, they can't turn around and avoid it. There are pursuit vehicles that will stop drivers who attempt to evade checkpoints, and they're very professionally run with an experience. So we talk about the theatre of road policing. So drivers will really remember the event, which is what we want. They'll talk about having been stopped and tested, and you'll hear this often said, that it was like driving through a movie set. Lots of flashing lights, lots of lighting, professionally dressed police, cones, signage, all creating an event in the minds of drivers. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. When we look at what we're trying to achieve as police, we would keep going back to Hommel's bucket, and it's a simple concept really. We want people in the bucket of deterred drivers. So how do we get people deterred? Well, it's catching people being caught and punished. That's the specific deterrence element. Visible police enforcement, talked about that. That's the general deterrence, very important. They'll hear about people being caught and punished. There'll be publicity on this. They'll hear this from friends. And there'll be publicity about police enforcement. So these processes in combination put people into the pool of deterred drivers. But you'll get leakage. So when you get examples of people talking about they evaded a checkpoint or they took a back road, that creates a problem for us because they'll tell others that they got away with it. If people are not seeing random breath testing sufficiently often and experiencing it, that will add to decreasing deterrence. And as I said, if people avoid punishment, that will also create a problem in terms of a lack of deterrence. So if we're getting an increased detection rate, we will be going back and asking ourselves about how we're meeting each of these criteria, because we want people in this deterred bucket area. So just as an example, while general deterrence is really important, if we really start to explain to the public why this issue is so problematic, the number of people who are being killed and grievously injured by drink drivers, you'll get information coming into police. So as a young sergeant, I remember receiving a letter from an anonymous writer who said, every day at this time, this individual driving this car drinks at this particular local pub. They then get into their car and they drive home. So we made a point of sitting off this bar, stopping that driver when they left and processing them for drink driving. And so specific deterrence is important on top of general deterrence and demonstrating to the public that you're taking the issue seriously. A couple of concepts of what best practice is. This area has been intensely researched by the Monash University Accident Research Centre, MUARC, in Victoria, Melbourne. And they came up with some principles. So as an operational police officer, I was routinely being briefed by the university on what the research was telling them and how to improve our operations to maximise deterrence. So here's just some examples. Now, these are specific to Melbourne, but information like this through your university should help, for example, work out what your optimal breath testing volumes would be across Dublin, for example, or your other major cities. So in Melbourne, RBT operations in urban areas that were focused on about 20 hours of activity per 100 square kilometres was the sweet point for maximising deterrence. So we had that as a principle that we applied. RBT in urban areas has residual effects for about 2 weeks. So after we run a big operation, the effect in suppressing drink driving will last for about 2 weeks. And this is a really important one. When we run drink drive operations at high alcohol hour periods, has a big crash reduction effect. When we ran it during daytime, low alcohol hours, we couldn't show any impact. So we have to focus on those key risk times and not waste effort on low alcohol hour testing. In terms of a graphic, this was really intended for police staff to just keep on reminding them about what we're trying to achieve. So road policing is most effective when it's unpredictable, unavoidable, and appears to operate everywhere. It's got to be conducted in an intensive and sustained manner to increase public's perception of risk. It's got to be random so people can't guess where we're going to be. We need highly visible operations. We've talked about that, but also some targeted operations to avoid punishment avoidance for those entrenched drink drivers who do need to be caught, who can't be deterred simply by the visibility. And we need to be supported by mass media and public education to keep on reinforcing those anti-drink drive messages. In terms of impact, here's just a couple of examples, but there are numerous other examples from the Australian states and territories and New Zealand. And what it really shows is this, that when you really start to ramp up random breath testing volume, you see large declines in the number of deaths as a result of drink driving. So scale up and you see the fatalities dropping off. However, equally, when in, this is Victorian information, there was a decline in testing volumes and visibility, there was an increase in the number of alcohol-related fatalities. So we've got to keep in mind that it's got to be ongoing. But when the intensity was renewed and there were system improvements, we saw this solid drop-off, which has been continued. So this is large-scale testing in the volume of 3 or 4 million tests per year across Victoria, which has a population, I guess, of about 6 million, so probably similar to what you've got there in Ireland. So over time, there's a very consistent inverse relationship. You increase random breath testing intensity, you'll see fatalities drop off. But when testing volumes and visibility decrease, you'll see the deaths rise. There's a very defined formula there. Same for my home jurisdiction in New Zealand. You'll see there the number of deaths involving alcohol-impaired drivers from 1984 down to 2024. Ongoing increases in volume of testing, and you see the numbers of drink driving start to really fall with some spikes when we needed to tinker with and improve the process. And again, high volumes of testing, 3 to 4 million tests a year that are currently detected with an absolute focus on those high alcohol hours, random and unpredictable testing. I just quickly focus on this, and I know time is limited. There is a different approach to rural drink driving. In my country, there's elaborate grapevines, unfortunately, that will often warn drink drivers at pubs about police activity. So the approach is different. So setting up a small checkpoint of a couple of officers, stopping 10 vehicles, going somewhere else, moving frequently so drivers can't predict where it'll be, targeting back roads as well as main roads, marked and unmarked patrol cars, not just large-scale checkpoints with booze buses, because we want to change behaviour so drivers can't take back roads or think they can outweight police. And if you apply this random and unpredictable approach, back roads, main roads, unmarked cars, so drivers come to understand police breath testing can't be evaded, it has a big impact on deterring drink driving in rural areas, which is just so important because of the challenges of dispersed populations and large road networks, which I know you do have in Ireland. So the last couple of things I wanted to touch on was one is police leadership. Police leadership really does matter. We've got to create an atmosphere of trust with our officers and the public, explain why we're doing this and explain it to the officers. Educating police on HOML's principles and operational good practice to keep our officers safe is essential. We want them accountable in terms of volumes of testing, but we want to explain why. We've got to maximise tests to keep people safe from drink drivers who kill and seriously injured innocent people. So this is a program in itself. The leadership dimension to good road policing is really important. Lastly, there are other opportunities. So we know there's a very direct link between increasing drink drive when trading hours for the sale of alcohol increase. So when trading hours increase, alcohol-related harm increases. It's associated with increase in assaults, unintentional injuries, and drink drive offences and road trauma. Restricting and narrowing trading hours has exactly the opposite effect. It reduces alcohol-related crime, assaults, and road trauma. So if there's any thinking about extending hours or restricting hours, if you extend hours, you'll increase harm, you'll increase drink drive deaths. If you restrict those hours, you will most definitely reduce your alcohol-related harm. And this information that I'm quoting comes from an assessment of multiple studies from around the world that show the same impacts. So this is just really summarising what I've talked about, which will be available with the presentation, and just highlight some of those key issues. But one of them also to think about is reviewing penalties and system problems. So, for example, I'm aware that in Ireland there's a 3-hour time limit in which police have to undertake a breath test. We don't have that. In New Zealand, the approach we have is to test without delay. So if there's a reasonable, there's a test of reasonableness. So, for example, if a driver runs off and tries to evade testing, and we catch them later, they are tested as soon as we practically can, but no one should benefit from simply trying to avoid testing. So there are no time limits. All police have to prove is that they were reasonable about administering the test as soon as they reasonably could. And this, again, is useful because it demonstrates to drivers that there's no benefit in running away or hiding or trying to delay testing, that will still hold them accountable. So I'll close now and pass back to you, Sheila, for the next presentation.
Thank you so much for that, Dave. There's absolute wealth of information